Games as a service is perhaps one of the most divisive statements in gaming today, and just mentioning it can send some gamers into an angry rant, whilst others just roll their eyes. I wanted to take a look at the games as a service model and how much value these games give the player, whilst also taking into account each of their release dates, monetization options, and where they are headed into the future. Let's discuss the issues I see these games having as gamers in the industry continue to change their view in regards to this service model. With the games released in various states, are consumers tired of being let down, or are the problems blown out of proportion? Some gamers are looking to play hours every day until their eyes bleed, whereas others are happy playing more casually for several hours per week only. The games as a service model incorporates many different games which can be very different to each other, but cost and balance remain key concerns. We have the likes of Destiny 2, The Division 2 and Anthem, which I've played extensively and have reviews for, and will also focus on due to their similarities and how the same mistakes keep happening in each. Whether games as a service is an acceptable model is usually dependent on if it respects players' time, the ongoing cost associated with games, plus the player community surrounding it and their patience when it comes to being in an abusive relationship half the time. So let's get stuck into the current state of these and whether this model can continue to survive as they currently are, whether they can actually improve or whether many gamers will grow tired of them. Games which basically keep promising they're going to go to rehab and get themselves sorted out, but only then to relapse and ask for more support. And by support, I mean your money. The three main problems in my view when it comes to games based upon a service can be broken down as follows. Firstly, the game can be released when it obviously is not ready to be. Secondly, the content which follows is either too thin, not of a high enough quality to warrant further expense. And thirdly, gamers have been lured into purchase the game based upon a roadmap which never sees the light of day, or gamers base the purchase on promises which never eventuate. But let's expand on each of these. The examples that instantly pop into my head when it comes to games which weren't ready to be released is Anthem, which is the most recent example. But also, surprisingly, both Destiny games as well. When Destiny released in 2014, it had huge potential, but it wouldn't take long for gamers to see that the overall experience was quite shallow and didn't offer a sufficient amount of content and didn't even match what had been shown pre-release. With cutscenes not existing in the final game and other footage being ripped out of the final product, all of these issues contributed to many gamers being disappointed and moving on, never to return. Often blaming the greed of Activision, but how they felt Bungie let them down. Leaving an incredible series in Halo only to make another sci-fi shooter, but make it worse. Others did stick around as the base gameplay, different character classes, and classic weapons were enough for many gamers, but it wasn't until a year later with the release of The Taken King where Bungie would rectify some of the problems, and over the 3-year lifespan of the game, Bungie would leave the first Destiny in a good place, a solid foundation in order to build upon for the sequel, except they almost went back to the drawing board and all of the progress and goodwill that had been made and earned was thrown out the window as Destiny 2 got rid of features such as random rolls on weapons which nobody asked for, and the supposed 10-year plan for the first game was dead and buried. Here is where games as a service obviously runs into problems. After all of the support and expense which Destiny fans gave the first game, they were basically asked to go through the whole ordeal again. Another game which was released when it needed more time in development, but what made it worse is that it was for no reason. Destiny fans were going back on a first date with the series, even though they had already been in this complex, long-term rollercoaster relationship of disappointment and excitement. Bungie had actually regressed with the sequel, except for actually taking it to the PC this time around. The 10-year plan had amounted to nothing, and players would be starting anew. And then we have Anthem, which was shown off to gamers when it wasn't even a game at all. It was a highly impressive gameplay sequence or tech demo. But that is all that existed at the time, and then BioWare would have only 18 months in order to deliver the goods. Let's put that into perspective. A development studio who had a huge amount of experience and success with single-player RPGs was now going to create an online, co-op, loot-based shooter which would provide enough content for gamers, including a campaign and side missions, worthy of the BioWare name, a large selection of interesting and quality weapons, all set in a huge, beautiful open world. Only some of these statements would remain true when gamers handed their money over for the game, but the biggest problem for gamers is that they paid full price for an early access game. Anthem was bare bones in areas such as weapon variety and activities, but the game also had perks on weapons that made no sense, such as having effects which lasted 0 seconds. It was obvious Anthem had been rushed out the door to meet its release date, but it had been in development for years already. Anthem is a perfect example for why gamers shouldn't buy into the hype of any new game until people have had the proper time to sit down and play it. And I don't mean the countless YouTube influencers that were flown out to events in order to play it and then cover it. Those who covered the game at release quickly began to ask themselves, where the hell was the rest of the game? The problem was that EA and BioWare were selling an idea of a finished game. Anthem sold in big numbers, so Anthem as a new game was a huge success, but the backlash from the gaming community was justified. The game had great flight mechanics, decent gunplay, and the fact it was co-op is always great, but Anthem and even Destiny had hyped themselves up far too much and were creating an illusion both Houdini and David Copperfield would have paid money to see. They were selling a promise they never kept, including a roadmap which would never see the light of day. Now, of course, it's better off not having a roadmap with new content coming out if there are deeper problems with the game itself that need fixing first. This would have been known all through development and at release. I understand BioWare and EA wanting to make a better game now, but it still doesn't make up for releasing a game which clearly wasn't finished, but was sold as if it was. And this is one problem that games as a service keeps having and will continue to have in the future. The games more often than not are being released with the minimum amount of content, which the developers and publishers think gamers will accept. It's the idea of having as minimal outlay as possible, getting the huge sales numbers, then keep gamers on the hook with the promises of fixes and extra content provided those same players stick with the game. And that there is another problem. Gamers will hopefully end up getting the game they paid for by usually investing more time and money into the experience, but then players simply become playtesters and they're paying for the privilege. If we take Anthem as an example, after the disastrous launch, when so many players left the game within the first few weeks, this then presents the issue of whether developers and publishers wish to keep supporting a game which is slowly dying, and so the roadmap got scrapped, and those players which enjoy the game enough to stick with it remain in limbo as to whether the game even has a future. But most importantly, gamers will stick with the game if they enjoy it, whether they think they got their money's worth and whether it delivered what was promised. Not a game with content ripped out only to be resold to players down the track. And then there's The Division 2, which is perhaps the odd one out amongst these games, as when we look at each when they released, The Division 2 was in the strongest position, was the most feature-rich and complete with minimal problems. It had a lengthy campaign, side activities to get involved with, and had enough loot and variety to keep players going, plus it had a strong endgame. But then, it has got to the brick wall that all of these games as a service eventually hit. The problem is the lack of content and the time it takes in order to deliver gamers more to play. But The Division 2 suffers as the others do, in that the time it takes to deliver sandbox updates for the game, whether it's to fix broken mechanics or other technical issues, just takes too long sometimes, and fans are usually left in the dark, as they were with Anthem's future, or they are left waiting far too long for a fix before they simply move on. This is where I give some slack to the developers, as to have a team capable of delivering the amount of content up to the quality that players want would be incredibly expensive and unrealistic. The game we can look to for how difficult it is to get content right is both Destiny games. They have large yearly updates, which have usually been very good. Then they would have smaller content drops a few times a year. These generally weren't all that good, and players, even those more casual ones, would complete their anemic campaigns and just wind up wanting more content once again. Since the split with Activision, Bungie has changed their content model into more seasonal, and over the course of those 3 months, content is drip-fed out, so there are always reasons for players to keep returning. This has been more successful, but has also introduced its own problems, with each season usually existing around a specific 6-player activity, which have been quite similar to each other, and story content so far hasn't continued on to each season to make the different story threads come together. Both Anthem and The Division 2 have run into issues with their stories, as they don't really deliver something of great quality, with Anthem probably being the most disappointing, as it's made from BioWare, a studio known for great storytelling. Now granted, these are loot-based games, so the narrative takes a backseat to the grind, but then players need a large amount of loot in order to chase without there being a huge amount of reskins. So if we say that these games constantly need quality content to make it worthwhile to invest our time in, how much are we willing to pay in order to be content? As mentioned earlier, each player is only able to invest a certain amount of time into the game per day, week or month. I doubt a casual player would want to spend as much as a hardcore player, due to them probably not having the time for all of the content anyway. But those hardcore players can never be satisfied, as the content will run dry for them, and they'll be stuck running the same missions and activities repeatedly, and no doubt receiving the same weapons and gear over and over again with minute differences, until they eventually reach that point and ask themselves, is this still worth playing? More casual players can have fear of missing out if the content or gear is time gated, and then hardcore players can also feel like they should be rewarded with certain hard to obtain weapons or armor because they put the time in to earn them. This is a balance which is extremely difficult for the developers to get right, but another area which needs work also is related to player power level and challenge. As players keep increasing their character's power, then challenge tends to go down in much of the content on offer, which then leads to the problem when the game overall, or a lot of the activities on offer, present no challenge, which makes players wonder why they should keep bother grinding for minuscule power increases or for better gear where there is nowhere to really use it. For many players, Destiny 2 and Anthem have become far too easy, and to a lesser extent The Division 2. But that's had an issue with grinding the world tiers and whether many of the players are bothered doing so. When we take all of the issues that these games seem to constantly have, and the difficulty that the development teams must have when trying to balance everything, including PvE and PvP, without breaking any existing mechanics, then what future does games as a service have going forward? If we take Destiny 2 as the example, it is always highly ranked on Steam, with it having thousands and thousands of players every day, and it's proven to be popular over the long term. Anthem's player base is very low, and The Division 2 isn't in the greatest place it has been in. It's impossible for developers to create as much content as players are after, and PvP has helped Destiny through several content droughts over the years. But I don't see games as a service going anywhere, at least in the near future. The model is too lucrative for developers and publishers, and these games aren't created like many others. It has carefully included mechanics to make players keep wanting to play and to keep handing over the money. Oftentimes it is an abusive relationship. Promises are always made, but the games themselves never actually meet expectations for the majority of players, and each player tends to become disenfranchised with the games just at different times. Season passes, expansion DLC, and microtransactions exist in all of these games to varying degrees, and whether it's worth handing over money for a lot of this content is ultimately up to the players themselves. These games also need to tread a fine line between giving players what they want, which is to earn tons of loot whilst enjoying the gameplay, but also offering enough new things so the experience doesn't become stale. The topic of grinding always comes up, and rightfully so, as it makes up so much of these games, but a player's time needs to be respected, and rewards need to be both obtainable and wanted. But for the game to keep being supported, that costs money, and when it comes to these examples, that cost passes on to the consumer, and it's up to us whether we are getting value for money and the content we want. But the question about these games as well is, what do we as gamers actually own? If the servers are switched off in future, we can no longer play the game at all unless we are given access to set up private servers. So, are games as a service a black mark on gaming these days? Well, if done well, they can give gamers an ongoing experience in a game they enjoy a lot. But players also need to accept that there will be issues, and developers need to treat their customers as players and not wallets. But we need to remember, the first Destiny was released in 2014, and it's heading towards its 6th year as a franchise, and Bungie still hasn't gotten the formula right. But if developers can keep their player base at a satisfactory level whilst earning what they need to, then games as a service will be around for a long time. It's just whether gamers will grow tired of waiting for the games to become what they want them to be.